But what I want to talk really quickly about the history of this place where we are right now. And the history of this place is about the people that were here for many years. And it's not a good history. It's not a good history. And I think by us all being in touch with the past and the things that happened in the past, and that's why, and why we're here today is to kind of to talk about the future. How do we move forward? How do we have a more equitable world? How do we treat people better? And how do and in doing that, the environment is all interlaced with that. So I just want to tell you a little historical story here. So as maybe many people might know, the Native American settlement in this area, Indigenous people settlement, it goes back thousands of years. And some people say it goes back into about 14,000 years. And in the mid-19th century, about 20 tribes lived in the Willamette Valley, which included the Kalapuya, the Molalla, and the Chinook. And these people owned their lands and had defined homelands, as I said, for at least 14,000 years or more. White settlers here began arriving in the 1840s after the 1806 Lewis and Clark expedition. And by the mid-1850s, most tribal people in this region had been removed by state and federal authorities to provide for white settlement. And then through a series of treaties, which began with the Oregon Treaty in 1846, the U.S. government created laws and policies to eradicate Aboriginal land claims in order to give settlers more land, for their settlement and farming. From 1848 to 1855, the U.S. made several treaties with the tribes of Western Oregon, as they did with other tribes in the Columbia River Basin. These treaties were designed to remove tribal people to make way for European settlements. In 1855, the treaty with the Kalapuya, known as the Willamette Valley Treaty, was negotiated with a confederation of 13 tribes. In December 1855, the U.S. government decided that they would have to forcibly remove tribal people from their homelands. From January to March 1856, tribes from Western Oregon were marched to the Grand Ronde Agency, and this was known as the Trail of Tears. A century later, in 1854, Congress terminated the Grand Ronde and the Siletz reservations and other tribes, which were 60 tribes in total, and terminated all treaty rights and agreements. In 1983, the Grand Ronde people successfully persuaded Congress and also President Reagan to restore the Grand Ronde tribal government. To this date, the Willamette Valley, Kalapuya, Molalla, and Clackamas Chinook people remain members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community. So that sums up my history. I just want us all to think about sort of this place where we are, the past that is built here, and how we move toward the future working together on these work efforts. So following that, I am incredibly honored today to introduce Kathleen George, who is the chair of the Oregon Environmental Commission, and she is also a longtime tribal council member for the Grand Ronde tribe. Kathleen and I worked very closely years ago to establish Oregon's protected human health water quality criteria, and we got to know each other, and I got to appreciate her amazing abilities. Since that time, she formed her own consulting firm, Cedarwood Consulting. She also led the Grand Ronde Tribe Spirit Mountain Community Fund, where she was responsible for millions of dollars of philanthropy distributed throughout the region, and also advocating for tribal nations and tribal people in that role. As I said, she currently serves as the Oregon Environmental Quality Commission, and we're really honored to have Kathleen speak to us this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Mary Lou, what a gracious introduction. And before I begin my comments about the Clean Water Act, which is what we're all here to talk about, I want to take a moment and just acknowledge what happened here. Mary Lou Soscia, long-time employee of the Environmental Protection Agency, federal employee, began her remarks by stopping and taking time to acknowledge the people who have always lived in this place. The people who knew how to live with clean water, whose lives depended on it. There was no other choice. This did not used to happen. I want to raise my hands to you, Mary Lou Soscia, and to the people who are doing this kind of good work. This is change, and I believe it's critically important change. Because I believe when we know where we come from, the people who lived here, and the lands and the history of a place, we have an infinitely better chance of learning how to live with it well today. So Mary Lou Soscia, I raise my hands to you. Thank you. But today we are primarily here to talk about 50 years of the Clean Water Act. How about that? And as on just about any 50th birthday, it is a time for both celebration and some reflecting on what might have gone better by now. It is wonderful to be here today with so many people who I've worked with, who I respect, and who have done so much to improve the quality of Oregon's waters. And I do want to start by acknowledging that although I did used to work pretty directly on Clean Water Act issues on behalf of tribes, I have not specialized in Clean Water Act related work for about 15 years. And so although my work with the Environmental Quality Commission and the Department of Environmental Quality brings me back to that world regularly, I will not pretend that I am the foremost expert on the Clean Water Act in the room. There are a lot of very smart people who are going to come on after me, and so I will try to not spend too much time on topics that I think that they will cover better than I will. But I will talk to you about the Clean Water Act as a citizen of Oregon, who has, in several different capacities, worked with, wrestled with, fought for, and listened to others about the Act and its many consequences. I also am not an attorney, as many of the people you will hear from today are. And it feels important to me personally to acknowledge as I begin that I come to this work in different roles. As said, I'm currently the chairwoman of the Environmental Quality Commission, and I'm also the elected tribal councilwoman of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. And both of those roles inform how I come to clean water issues. Now, one great benefit of being a keynote speaker is that I get to raise the big and challenging questions and then leave it to the rest of the speakers to answer them. And I intend to take full advantage of this. So here we go. Let's start with the goals of the Clean Water Act. What were they? They were a whole lot. And I promise not to read all of the goals and intentions from the beginning of Act, but please bear with me for just a minute to acknowledge a few that I think really just set the stage for how ambitious the Clean Water Act was. So here we go, Section 101.1. It is the national goal that the discharge of pollutants into the navigable waters be eliminated by 1985. How are we doing on that? Number 2, it is the national goal that wherever attainable, an interim goal of water quality which provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife and provides for recreation in and on the waters be achieved by July 1, 1983. How about that one? All right, number 3, it is the national policy that the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts be prohibited. No more of that. Number 7, see, I only got to 3, and I'm already skipping provisions. Now you know why lawyering is not the path for me. Number 7, it is the national policy for the control of non-point sources of pollution to be developed and implemented in an expeditious manner so as to establish the goals of this act to be met through the control of both point and non-point sources of pollution. And a whole lot of other things that go on for 234 pages. So this is an ambitious act and undertaking at its time, right? And it sets some conflicting sets of expectations. because despite saying that we were going to eliminate pollution and pollution discharges to the waters of the United States, it also goes on to talk about exactly how we're going to allow, permit, regulate those discharges. Both are there, and both are true, and both regulated and unregulated discharges continue today. And so, of course, broadly speaking, the Clean Water Act sets out a course for states, tribes, other jurisdictions implementing the Clean Water Act to identify what are those beneficial uses of waters that then the jurisdiction intends to protect. And this, of course, can be all the things just about that you can think of for water. It can be drinking water, cattle watering, agricultural irrigation, fish habitat, recreation, and most of the uses of water that we all enjoy. So how have we done on these goals? Well, as the good senator noted, there's some things to celebrate for sure. Our nation's waterways are no longer, generally speaking, open sewers or unlimited conduits of industrial waste streams. And in many metropolitan areas, they don't look like they did in the 1950s and 60s. And I am told by people who experienced it in the day, can also be said for parts of the Willamette. And, on the other hand, far too few of our rivers and lakes are fishable and swimmable. Can support the salmonid species that are so important to Oregonians. Fishable, swimmable being another goal that the statute established. And we are obviously not even remotely close to the future envisioned where water pollution was fully eliminated. And so like most human systems, there are winners and there are losers as we look back over 50 years of the Clean Water Act. Now I'm going to provide a small and admittedly incomplete list, because again I have to leave something for the other speakers. So winners. So organizations who need permitted discharge of pollutants, which probably includes the municipalities of the places where most of the people in this room live. They ideally have a process with which to obtain permits needed to discharge water and pollution to waters of the state, as do businesses or other organizations that have that need. There's a process for that that does its best to control and minimize the pollution of that discharge. And so that's available to other businesses and dischargers in general. Now, some ears may have perked up at the reference to obtaining permits because they may and perhaps could fairly make the argument that the timely access to such permits and the renewal of them can, and in several cases has been lacking. We have had some challenges in the state of Oregon with this that we understand and acknowledge. That observation would not be wrong. The NPDES permit backlog is something that the Department of Environmental Quality has been working very aggressively to fix and is making good progress on. I believe that it must also be said that this permit backlog is at least in part a consequence of underfunding an agency. Another benefactor of the water quality permitting regime is, of course, the water-using public. Any facility discharging pollution into our waters not only does so when they've obtained said permit and an engineer has written that permit to minimize or otherwise place limits on what can be discharged. That is to be revisited over time and improved as technology and the ability to improve the removal of pollutants from the waste stream advances. So over time, we should be getting cleaner and cleaner discharge. Winners, watersheds where TMDL, or total maximum daily loads, essentially our water quality cleanup plans under the Act, where we've made real progress on TMDL implementation and pollution loads have been significantly diminished. And to people doing that good and hard work, we thank you. Also, billions of dollars are handed out to local governments each year to help finance water infrastructure upgrades and pollution control projects. Those are critical to small communities, especially who would not have that capacity on their own. And I think one of the acknowledgments we have to make is that one of the greatest features of the Clean Water Act was the way in which it gave the public greater access and participation in the regulatory decisions that impact their waters. right? So when permits are issued or reissued, there's a role for public comment and participation. When TMDLs are developed, whether you participate through a local government or a business or a nonprofit advocacy group, there's ways to come to the table. There's a way to advocate for your people and your people's water needs. And indeed, there's the ability to challenge actions taken by a state or jurisdiction if you feel that they're not sufficiently meeting up to the goals of the act, and that, of course, has also been exercised many times. So that new and additional access to the people over those regulatory decisions to their waters, I think, is a huge one. Some losers. Not necessarily through intent, but it is a reality that I think it is really important to acknowledge out loud, is that all communities are not equally impacted by poor water quality, nor do they benefit equally in the ability to protect and preserve clean water. Some of the groups that often fall into this category are poor and rural communities. It is a tragic and unacceptable reality that today, in 2023, our cousins over on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation have not consistently had drinkable water coming out of their taps for the last 3 years, at least, if not longer. Work is being done on this with the Warm Springs people and on behalf of other agencies. But every one of us who this morning made our tea or coffee or go home tonight and can turn on the tap and count on that water being drinkable, we enjoy a tremendous luxury that those people do not. And I think it's critically important for us to call ourselves as a community of Oregonians to count and to do better. I was also informed just last week by a tribal councilman for the Kuslo or Umpqua and Sayusla Indians that in the community of Mapleton, they have had no clean water in January. That's a community in which many Kuslo or Umpqua and Sayusla tribal members live. And these are just 2 examples of many communities in Oregon who could be added to this list. And we tend to imagine that those are other world problems. Those are things that occur in distant, exotic places, but they are not at all. They are a regular reality to our fellow Oregonians. And I think it is incumbent upon us to find a way to do better. We could include on this list some small municipalities in our Coast Range who have recently been reaching out to DEQ and EQC because they have a very real struggle to deal with the serious river sediment and other water quality treatment challenges to provide drinking water to their communities. And then this sometimes puts them in a very difficult position with major employers in their communities. There's this push-pull in many of our communities, and the answers are not simple, but the challenges are great, especially to small communities that do not have a lot of resources. And we have to say that at the same time, we do have many facilities who are presently violating their Clean Water Act permits, and hundreds of cities with antiquated or failing water infrastructure that are in desperate need of capital infusions. And there's this dynamic that is sometimes set up between, or at least a perceived dynamic, those advocating for improved water quality and those who ability to conduct their business and make their profit rely upon the necessity of discharging to the waters. And there's this perception that it's one side versus the other. It's implementation of the Clean Water Act versus aversion to control and enforcement measures that are expensive. And yet it must really be said that it just really depends on what your economy and what your bottom line is fed by. That can be a very true dynamic for an industry or for a business that relies on being able to manage the land in the way that they want or they feel they need to. And it also has to be said that if your business and bottom line relies on fishing or fishing tourism, if we do not protect the waters to support the river resources that those folks need, their bottom line is impacted as well. So The economy versus resource issue is always not as clear as we sometimes pretend that it is. And I think that it's interesting at this point in time to acknowledge that some of the challenges that we face are the reality of a Clean Water Act paradigm that made sense to its creators at that point in time for the problems that they solved, or the problems that they saw and they wanted solved, but today don't quite meet with our scientific understanding of our waters. So they saw rivers that were, functioning like open sewers. They saw rivers catching on fire. They said, well, we're going to do something about that. But we certainly don't want to get involved in water rights or water quality issues. That's not what we're talking about here. But in many places, it is an unavoidable reality that we really cannot talk about water quality without talking about water quantity and the concentration of pollutants. And certainly here in the state of Oregon, for many years, I worked on the east side of Oregon, and we worked on rivers over there where at certain times of the year, the discharge from a facility would be a significant percentage of the flow in a river at certain times of the year. So it's not so easy to just say, well, turn off the pollution. You may be turning off half that river's flow in a particular month. So it's really a scientific unavoidable fact that in many places we cannot talk about quality without talking about quantity. Surface water versus groundwater. Well, they certainly weren't going to be involved with groundwater. That's wells and other things like that. That's not what they were talking about. And yet we have come to understand that groundwater is the next bend in the river's surface water, and perhaps the next bend in the river's groundwater again. And that when water quality and quantity, when groundwater and surface water are truly inseparable, and yet our regulatory paradigm largely pretends that we can manage these issues separately, we cannot be surprised that that lends us some significant challenges. I did have the opportunity for many years to work for the Umatilla tribe, who in implementing their temperature TMDL worked with the Environmental Protection Agency to try to do the best that they could to implement protection for hyperrheic flows, those subsurface groundwater flows that, especially in those arid systems in the east, move in and out of the floodplain. And in fact, through their surveys, they could demonstrate that that was actually the most powerful temperature-regulated function of that system. On the west side here, we're used to our big trees and our beautiful forests and shade-dominated systems. That simply is not true and probably has never been in some places. So, and lastly, I think that we have to acknowledge that when Congress passed the Clean Water Act, most members at the time had never heard probably of the greenhouse effect or any impacts it might be having to our climate. And so at the same time that we have those very extreme, wide-ranging temperatures across the state of Oregon, we also are faced with warming air and warming climate, and we're not going to get the job's not going to get any easier on the climate side of things. So where have we fallen short? I think there'll probably be a few things that come up today. One thing I want to talk about is how we deal with our non-point source pollution. So the pollution that does not come out of pipes, that comes off of our backyards and our streets and our farms and our forest areas and just flows, finds its way back into our waters. This is obviously a real challenge, and it's one that DEQ works on very regularly. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. I want to also talk about temperature. Very widespread problem that is contributed to by both point and non-point sources, and gets largely started up and driven high in watersheds by non-point sources. And in doing that, I want to consider its impact on one key beneficial use for our discussion today. So the Clean Water Act lays out this kind of long process to get to water quality restoration, right? So we have beneficial uses, and so then we establish standards that will protect the beneficial uses, and then we analyze the waters and we say which ones do and don't comply, and for those ones that don't comply, they go on a special list, the 303D list. Those lists need TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, water quality cleanup plans, which then need to be implemented. And for some of our most time-sensitive beneficial uses, like our endangered salmon populations, the time may be up. The time may be up. They don't have time for us to do and redo and take years and years to improve water quality. Many Oregon basins, salmonid habitat is the most sensitive beneficial use and is the driver of water quality regulation. And I'm going to focus on my home basin, the Willamette River. This basin once supported tremendous salmon runs and a large salmon economy. After decades of declining numbers, the National Marine Fisheries Service listed the upper Willamette River Chinook and steelhead as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1999. Today, by any measure, the numbers are dire. Less than 10,000 wild Chinook salmon return each year to the upper Willamette Basin. This is an approximately 97% reduction of the historic estimates. The upper Willamette Chinook in most subbasins have, and I quote, a very high risk of extinction according to the National Marine Fisheries Service, and their populations are continuing to decrease. Late run winter steelhead have seen a nearly 70% reduction from the 1970s when data was first available. And yes, there are absolutely many challenges facing our native fish beyond water quality. And yes, without water cold and clean enough to support the life stages of salmon, the other challenges won't matter so much. TMDL implementation. For a lot of reasons that other speakers will comment on, this has often been slow to happen. In many places, it has not happened to a tremendously significant extent at all. And this is a place where the Clean Water Act does not give us a clear regulatory path all the way through implementation. And in one Oregonian, just one Oregonian opinion, mine, Oregon law and policy has at times been less than clear to help regulators, designated management agencies, know whose turn it is or who does what when, and when we know we've waited too long, so somebody has to do something else. This is something the Environmental Quality Commission has been working with DEQ on in a very focused way for the last several years. And DEQ has been working with designated management agencies to come to clearer agreements. For the folks who follow such things, the new memorandum of agreement with the Department of Forestry that was signed last year is very different from the ones in the past. And it gets down to how do we work as two sister agencies to get to implementation on these clean water requirements. And right now, DEQ is in the process of negotiating a new MOA with the Oregon Department of Agriculture that again seeks to do that, seeks to clarify roles, expectations, and even timelines for check-in so that we can know whether or not we're making progress, and if not, we come back to the table and we talk about why. So, Oregon, while challenged by many problems, right, we have the opportunity to look to other places, other states, and decide how things have worked out there for their waters, and if that's the path that Oregon is on. It is also within our power to choose to keep what is precious about our Oregon waters, but that is tough. That requires hard work and negotiation and compromise, and those things can be very difficult. But truly it is up to us which path we are on. Our primary regulatory tool for getting or keeping the water we need to have the Oregon we love is the Clean Water Act, and then the Oregon water quality provisions that in some places have gone beyond the federal requirements. And so the Clean Water Act is both a powerful, an incomplete, and an imperfect regulatory tool. So I've been talking to you from the kind of perspective that I often use in my work with DEQ and on the Environmental Quality Commission. But as I finish, I want to share a very different view with you. I want to share a bit of a view from my home. And it is January now, so it is winter. And in my tribe, it is the season for a con. It is the season for storytelling. So I'm going to share with you a small piece, an abbreviated piece, of one of our treasured coyote stories. And for those of you who may be familiar with Pacific Northwest coyote stories, you may know that coyote often shows us what not to do. Coyote, after several attempts to make Tumwata, what we now know Willamette Falls, he tried in several places. Many people don't know this, and he said this place was not quite right, and that place was not quite right. So he kept working his way downriver, and finally he came to the place where Tumwata is now. He made the falls high and wide so that the people could better catch the salmon. But after doing this, Coyote was hungry, and he wanted something to eat. So he decided that he would go down to the river and he would make a magic fish trap. So this is what he did. And he made the trap so then when it was full of salmon, it would say, no seeps. So he would know that the trap was full and come and take the salmon out of the trap. So, having made the magic fish trap, he turned to go up the bank to make his fire so that they would be ready when he got his fish to cook his fish. But he only got halfway up the bank when he heard no seeps, no seeps. And Coyote went back down the bank, and sure enough, the trap was full of fish. He took out all the fish and he put them on the bank, and he headed back up to make his fire, and again, no seeps, no seeps. He went back down, and again the trap was completely full. Again, Coyote took the fish out of the trap and put them on the bank and went back up to try to make his fire, and this happened again and again, and on the 5th time, Coyote lost his patience, and he said, "What? Can't you wait with your fish catching until I've built my fire?" And at this, the magic fish trap was very offended, and it stopped working right then. Cubble, for good. And after that, the people had to struggle to catch the fish as best they could. So as often the case, Coyote shows us something, maybe, about ourselves. We are both clever and powerful in making use of our rivers. And we need to remember that the precious gifts of our waters can be lost if we are unwise in our appreciation of the gifts of our rivers. So, thank you for your attention to these thoughts, and I am really looking forward to hearing how Dana Polsky is going to solve all these challenges. Yeah, thank you.